Hello, I'm Pastor Hilly. Thank you for joining us for Faith Lutheran Church's Adult Forum series. We're calling this episode The Three Folds of the ELCA. But before we get to this week's special guest, a brief reminder that during this time of social distancing, there is wonderful ministry coming out of the community that we call Faith Lutheran Church in Whitehall, Ohio. Ministry that includes this very podcast. If you would like to support the ministry of faith financially, please find the link labeled Giving in the description below. And now, on to our episode. Joining me this week is pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Enumclaw, Washington, the Reverend Eric Wooldridge. Reverend Wooldridge, how are you and the family doing during this whole pandemic reality, my friend?
We're doing just as well as a lot of families are doing, which is we're thankful to be safe and well at this point. And I know those that have not been affected directly by the pandemic are thankful as well. And yet, like a lot of parents, we wish our kids were back in school. It's like that old Christmas song, Mom and Dad can hardly wait for school to start again, but it just keeps going and going. And so, yeah, we've got the same burdens that a lot of people have, but just thankful for the blessings that are there nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. I get that, man. So as we kind of sit down at our respective offices across America, it is today is Thursday. We are 3 days away from Reformation Sunday. And typically on Reformation Sunday, we all get together as Lutherans and we sing A Mighty Fortress and we celebrate our rich Lutheran heritage. And this year, Reformation Sunday is going to look really different across congregations in our country and around the world, because not only are we amid a pandemic, but for our brothers and sisters out west, out where you are in Washington State, there are also the wildfires. So like, I guess one of my first questions for you is, here in Ohio, you know, it's still touch and go. Are we worshiping in person? Are we not? And there's a lot of different approaches to that. Has the reality of the wildfires pushed back those conversations or complicated those conversations for you and the great people of Trinity?
I know it's complicated conversations for a lot of churches. We've been, just mercifully spared from some of the worst parts of the fires as they happened. And actually, first of all, as an aside, you did a much better job of getting a great background for Reformation. I've just got a random collection of books behind me, and there you've got Dr. Luther right over your shoulder. So
it's actually Bugenhagen.
That's Bugenhagen?
Oh, that is Bugenhagen.
Well, look at me. With our history, I should have recognized that right away. But yeah, that's well done. I want to compliment you on that. But anyway, with the fires and getting started and everything, your word complicated that definitely applies. Different churches have had to think about that. In our case, because we had fires actively burning 10 miles to our east, 10 miles to our west, and somehow in Enumclaw, Washington, we happened to be one of the few areas that didn't get directly hit, even though, you know, folks lived in those areas. And so bringing somewhat of a sense of normalcy and following the plans that we had already laid out for moving from more online formats and getting some ministries back in person as much as we could do that safely was what we felt like one of the gifts we could give to people to try to continue and show a sense of normalcy in such a chaotic time.
No, that makes all the sense in the world. We've seen that here in the Columbus area, where just with the pandemic being what it is, you know, people are just so thirsty. They're starving for anything that looks like normalcy. And that's without that complicated layerdom of pandemic and fires and whatever else may be happening. I can't imagine it. And that speaks low to what you're doing in that community on a number of different ways.
Yeah, and it's there for all of us. We've talked in the past. I know so many people in your area have been dealing with floods. I mean, maybe not historic floods, but when that got layered on top of the pandemic, I know that was so difficult for folks in Columbus specifically. I don't know how widespread that was. And then here it was, fires on the other end. I joked with one of my friends from college who lived in a flooded area in the South earlier that we can just, solve the energy crisis and get some sort of huge pipeline to efficiently transport water from east to west, we can solve two problems every single season, because it seems to come around a lot. But I'll tell you what, it was definitely a different fire season. In the state of Washington, we actually talked a little bit earlier on in August or so. My wife and I talked about how light it seemed like the fire season was, and that maybe we were just going to get a break where it wasn't a problem for 1 year. And it was so acute when Labor Day came around. It was actually on Labor Day. It was the most intense single day of fires in the recorded history of the state. It was, I believe it was 330,000 acres burned in a day. And I know for some people, it's hard to have a context of, what 30,000 versus 3 million acres is, but that's more land than had burned in the entire fire season the year before, or any year in recent history, and it all burned in one day. So it was such a strange series of events that happened so intensely all at once that it really threw us all for a loop. Yeah.
And so, I mean, even as you make that comment, the thing I was thinking was, it's one thing to say that the 2020 fire season has taken a disastrous toll across the West Coast. But I know a lot of people on the East Coast here in the Midwest would say, well, what do you mean fire season? I thought this was an anomaly. But no, like fire season is a normal annual part of the culture there, right? It's kind of like hurricane season in North Carolina.
Absolutely. Yep. And it's most pronounced in the far Southwest. I think that folks in Nevada and California are probably the most familiar with it. But it tends to happen. There are a few fires every year in all the states throughout the West. And typically in a state like Washington, August, early September would be the rough time. But hopefully, it's just like every state knows how to prepare for its own disasters. Minnesota would be embarrassed if they didn't have enough plows for a blizzard, and North Carolina would be embarrassed if they didn't have the equipment to try to address the after effects of a hurricane. And the firefighters are they're proud to do their job, and they like to announce, oh, now we've got such and such a fire, 50% contained, 75% contained. And because it all happened at once, of course, they were just absolutely overwhelmed. There were no amount of planning could have gotten us prepared for 338,000 acres in one day.
Yeah. So what does it look like? Give me a daily snapshot. I mean, you're talking not your specific community, but like the neighboring kind of communities to that. People are definitely impacted and affected. In those neighboring communities, is the threat still very real? Is it an hour-by-hour threat? Is it a day-to-day threat? Is it, oh no, the wind is blowing east, we got to readjust?
Right. Thankfully, the threat the immediate fire threat has passed at this point. We've gotten enough cold weather and enough rain that I don't think we have active fires in Washington right now, so it's fully into recovery mode. A couple of ways that we still are experiencing those things, however, we've got a highway, the main highway that goes through our town. As it goes off kind of toward the Cascade Mountains, there's still some threat for on one of the hillsides where trees might come that have been damaged, might come barreling down the hill into the highway. Instead of just having it wide open, they have twice a day convoys of cars that are allowed to go through. So a tiny little town called Greenwater, just down the road, its only highway, and if you live in Greenwater, they say you don't get to travel. You don't get to go get your groceries or whatever unless you want to go in the convoy that goes out in the morning or the convoy that comes through in the afternoon. So it's still affecting people in those ways. One thing I'm really thankful of, though, is that the air quality has finally returned to normal. We've had a few weeks now of good, solid air quality, and that was the eeriest part of it. When in the midst of the pandemic, when the whole deal is be careful of the air when you're inside, and then it was everybody stay inside because the air outside is hazardous to breathe. Or it was actually some days they would call it unhealthy, and then it would upgrade to very unhealthy, and then for just a few days it bumped up to hazardous. And people they'd take those those filters that you usually use for a furnace in a house, and you replace it every once in a while in your furnace. The
Yeah.
recommendation was take one of those and tape it to a fan, like a regular box fan, and then just put that in the middle of your room so that that filter is just slowly
Oh,
accumulating
wow.
some of the particles that are coming in from the outside, because you also can't just seal up your house
Right.
for days at a time, or else you get a danger of carbon dioxide. So air quality was the thing that I think was surreal for a lot of people. The idea that we couldn't take breathing clean air for granted.
Right.
It was pretty rough. Yeah.
I mean, so at that point in time, it's like, all right, you're going inside somewhere, wear a mask. You're going outside, wear a mask. You're at
Yeah,
home, wear a mask, right?
that's
Like,
right.
yeah, time to take a shower, leave the mask on, right? Like, oh my God. Yeah,
Well, it's
man.
been a boon for companies, entrepreneurial companies that make creative types of masks, right? So everybody figures out a good way to take
Yeah,
advantage of any situation.
man. I was thinking about this, and this is just an aside. I mean, your kids are of the age where it's like trick or treat season.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, part of trick or treating is that social, bunch of kids running around. But on the other end of that, they're already wearing masks, right? Like they could be from Paw
Yeah.
Patrol, like that. Or does the mask have to wear a mask, right? Like that.
That's a great question that I hadn't thought about.
No,
So,
it gets very meta. It gets very meta very fast. But I do want to talk a little bit, because during this catastrophe, you and your congregation there at Trinity Lutheran have kind of been like right there in that kind of ground zero area, looking at the communities around you, seeing need, being well tied into your community with other organizations providing need.
mhm.
And I'd assume that, there are probably people calling your congregation, even from outlying towns that have lost everything in the fires. And so, like, now that we're in the recovery stage, how much need is there in your greater area?
Yeah, it's not exactly the type of need that I would have expected. And that's part of why you trust in these, larger organizations that have the infrastructure to do this. So for immediate needs, this was one of those situations where the idea of tight-knit communities was so critically important. So we have gotten some calls, and we, like a lot of congregations, have a pastoral assistance fund where we can distribute money to people for their immediate needs, just for food and things like that. When it came to shelter, we immediately called our, like I said, there were fires 10 miles in either direction from us, not directly in our town. So we immediately made a call to Creator Lutheran Church just down the road from us, who were, a lot of their folks were, in fact, their actual church building was right on the line of an evacuation zone for a couple of days, and so they were a little bit more affected. And I was so pleased to hear from Amanda over at Creator that neighbors and family had stepped up. So people had lost their houses, either got evacuated or actually had houses burned. And the immediate response was, families have actually taken in their other family members, neighbors have taken in their other family members. And that's the kind of thing where usually the narrative of today is that, well, society's kind of breaking down, people don't take care of each other. And this really flew in the face of that. People stepped up. And I would love to hear from you. Have you found some of that as well with the pandemic specifically, that people taking care of their neighbors, going to buy groceries or for people in need? Have you seen a fair bit of that in your community as well?
Absolutely. I've heard a lot of those stories that are neighbors taking care of neighbors. One of the things that we were doing here at Faith, and we did it in May and August and in September, was, like a lot of pastors in the situation, the building is not open for worship on Sunday morning, but so many people like want an excuse to get out. So those 3 months, we had a drive-by, touchless drop-off donation drive for Lutheran Social Services Food Pantry. That was all of the items that they were looking for. And so for 3 months, we put together this huge collection of, mandarin oranges and peanut butter and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And we actually had one of the LSS directors come out, and we did a socially distant picnic, and he was talking about how when the economy first shut down, the bad part of trickle down economics is that when everything stops at the top, everything, like, there's no more trickle.
It's tough. Yep.
They had seen a huge amount of people at LSS donating money or items on their food drive to make sure that the neighbors are taken care of. And like a fun story, and this will be old hat for the people here at Faith, but we used to do a open taco meal on the fourth or third Tuesday of every month, and we called it Taco Tuesday.
Yeah.
So I became, like, for people who don't know, the good Reverend Wooldridge and I were seminary roommates for 2 years, and we've been running these roads for a while together. And
it's been fantastic.
Yeah, and we've been trained in really similar ways, right? So I get to Whitehall, which is a community within Columbus, and I get to know, like, restaurant owners and business owners, and there's a brewery 2.5 miles from my church. So I get to know those guys. And I actually helped design a beer with that brewery. And they called it Taco Pump because it pumped $1.50 of every beer came back to the church to pay for Taco Tuesday.
Yep.
But that beer was supposed to be it was released February 28th, and it was going to pay for Taco Tuesday in March.
Yeah.
And everything shut down.
Yeah.
And I know a food truck guy, and the food truck guy was like, hey, I already have the permit. Can I set up on, like, let's say Sunday evening from 4 to 6 and just let me give away free meals? Because I want to make sure kids in my community are still getting fed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was down talking to the Two Tones guys about a week ago, and we were having this conversation that through this pandemic, we have a church, a brewery, and a food truck working together to make sure kids are fed.
That's ministry.
Yeah, that is great ministry on every level. And I don't know. I mean, the food truck guy, Will, great guy. He probably would have been on board either way, but because of the pandemic and we couldn't have the free meal in the church, it allows the community to think about new ways of taking care of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those stories are amazing.
That makes complete sense. Yeah. And I'll tell you what, as far as those immediate connections with figuring out where the need is and finding the right connections, your congregation's offer and willingness to do your monthly donations toward fires, it made us need to ask a few questions, because early on, what I was describing about the need, it seemed like the need wasn't nearly as severe just because people were taking care of each other. And we started gearing up for the more long-term stuff for supporting Lutheran disaster response for the needs that you just can't avoid by looking towards your neighbor or family. But in our communication, and you're talking about Faith Lutheran with your monthly project and wanting to support the fires. Yeah, cause of the month. It made us need to go back and say, now wait a minute, let's just ask the question once more, except not from that higher level of what are the Lutheran disaster response level organizations, but have we checked in with all the people we could? And so I talked with our financial secretary, and she says, actually I've got a good friend who's over in Rosalia, and Rosalia happens to be a town right next to another town called Malden, which just Malde, and it just burned to the ground on Labor Day on that day. We just had to get a little farther geographically to find that, okay, now here's this community in Rosalia where it is, every little dollar is one more person that, whether because they didn't have insurance on their house when it burned down or some other circumstance, really is right there on the edge. And they've got a partnership of churches, and it's specifically the Lions Club. This woman, I got a hold of this woman, and she says, I'll tell you who's doing the direct work right here in the community. It's the Lions Club. And so, for any listeners who are Kiwanis or Rotary, sorry, in this case, the Lions Club, they win the prize. But but to be able to go through those individual connections rather than kind of sitting back and depending on the higher level organizations, it was your communication that prompted us to revisit that and find, because when like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is giving out a multi-million-dollar grant, you got to go through the big organizations, check all the boxes. But when we're talking about the partnership between churches, that's when you've got the advantage of being able to say, look, I know a woman, I know a guy,
Mhm.
I know they're trustworthy. And it's going through the Lions Club, it's going through official channels still, but it's so much more efficient. I mean, the money is just going to get right there to feed people and keep a warming center open for people that otherwise are right on the edge of I don't know, of homelessness possibly. It's
Yeah.
a pretty desperate in that particular town.
And I think that that's one of the great strengths we have as a culture in the 21st century with things like cell phones and all that kind of thing, right? Like our ability to have real-time responses
Mm-hmm.
is at a pace that it has never been before, right? So just
Oh yeah.
culturally, we're in a really good place to have that. And I think the other part of that, and you and I were kind of talking about this before we recorded, and it's a great point to bring up 3 days before Reformation Sunday. But we in the ELCA, if we think back to all those wonderful books about organizational structure and doctrine that we were forced to buy and probably didn't read as much as we should have,
Right. Yeah.
the ELCA understands itself as a church in which there are three expressions of that church.
Right.
There's the
Yes.
congregational level, the synodical level, and then the church-wide level or the international.
Yep.
And I think that a great example of church-wide relief is Lutheran Disaster Relief, who, if you go to Lutheran Disaster Relief's website, you can donate to their big fund that is that kind of like big dollars coming down from the top.
Yes. Yep.
I know I have to assume that, Northwest Washington Synod, which is your synod, right?
We're the very northernmost congregation in the Southwestern Washington Synod.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? Huh.
Yeah.
But like, I assume that that they are also doing things to try to meet those needs. But
Yes.
on that friend level, to just be like, hey, I know you're out there. I know this is your neck of the woods. On that congregational level, to say, hey, we're a church in Ohio. You're a congregation in Washington State. As friends and as people with the ability to do ministry together, let's do this. And I think it's the best. Like, I don't think in 1988, when the ELCA came into being, they could imagine the reality that we have at hand.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They would have needed to be, clairvoyant to to see it. And those three expressions really do all have their place. I think you've hit on a perfect example of where that happens. Because, like, for example, at the synodical level, one of the things that I mentioned is it seemed like in the early response to the fires, it felt like, this is almost going too smoothly. And one of the things in looking back that was responsible for that, for the response going smoothly, I looked back at the Synod newsletter, the September newsletter, which would have come out just before the big rash of fires on Labor Day. And they just happened to have an article in that Synod newsletter pushing congregations to refamiliarize themselves with Lutheran disaster response, especially in our region. And it was the pandemic that prompted that. But of course, it was the fires that ended up being the big focus for that time. And so there was, the synodical level doing its job in both bringing congregations together and focusing congregations on, what was the right cause for the right time. And of course, we've already talked about it, the church-wide level, Lutheran, is it Lutheran disaster relief or response? Actually,
I think it's relief.
Okay, good.
I feel like we're both bad at this if neither one of us knows.
That's a little embarrassing, yeah, but don't people like it? It humanizes, to make little mistakes like that. So good. That's we both need our dose of humble pie all the time. But that is a church-wide response that is the infrastructure that is already there. There's so much that you can't just respond to, that you have to be preparing for these types of disasters beforehand, and that's where that kind of a level comes in. They already have infrastructure in place. So every level has been amazing.
Absolutely. And to think about, LDR doing their thing that they do so well. And to think about support that comes on a synodical level. I mean, I know you've been in, have you always been in Southern Washington, or was your first call Northern?
I've been, the Southwestern Washington. So just as a little background, the Western Washington is divided into Northwest Washington Synod, which loosely defined would be the congregations that are most likely to relate to Seattle as a metro area.
Okay.
And then Southwestern Washington Synod would be more congregations that would relate to Tacoma as a metro area, and then the Olympic Peninsula and getting down toward Portland. And so it's one, when they divided up all the synods in the ELCA, there are certain places where you just had to either say, we're going to have one Godzilla synod here, or we're going to have two that are just a little smaller than normal. They decided two that are just a little smaller than normal.
Yeah.
And so we have Northwest Washington, Southwest Washington. And then when you get over to Eastern Washington and Idaho, it's called the Northwest Intermountain Synod.
Yeah.
And that's where the worst of the fires would have been on that Labor Day time, kind of towards Spokane, which is probably their biggest metro area in their synod. Yeah.
Huh. Well, I just think about myself having spent time in Northern Illinois Synod and New England Synod and Southern Ohio Synod. I always see synods doing really great work, but we know from the chairs that we sit in, that's going to take a little time to kind of help that happen.
Oh yeah.
And I think that the real big benefit and beauty of kind of like our congregational touchstones between one another is for the community you were talking about, Malden, that the entire community was just leveled.
Yeah.
Maybe the funds that we are sending help those people get from today to when that synodical support can arrive.
Right? Exactly. Yeah.
And so we all tie into one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And those synodical and church-wide funds, they're going to go toward a lot of the same things. They're going to end up spending some of it on food, certainly on housing type things, and also, even the mental and emotional support that needs to go along with some of that, all the disaster response stuff. But there's no way for in the immediate days after, it has to be people that know other people. Right. And that's what was there in the community. Getting that money there really early on meant that people who know people could help the people that they know. So just a perfect way for it to go.
And I don't want to blow this horn too much, but like being Reformation Week, this is the week to blow it. I think that we are really living into kind of like the best vision of what the ELCA could be. I mean, with that, there's always the asterisk, right? It's always sad that it takes pandemics and, horrible catastrophes like the wildfires, especially over that weekend, to bring this out of people. But it is a really beautiful thing to see the church mobilize in so many different ways, and to see the church mobilize in their communities in really different ways. I think that one of the things that the pandemic has kind of done has forced us as Lutherans to be a lot more nimble than we have been in the past.
Yes.
And nimbleness is not our strength. It's
not at all.
But suddenly when the doors are shut and you have to, necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Yes, it is.
And so I don't know. Yeah, it gets me really excited. And this is what gets me excited about it. All right. So Martin Luther was born in 1483, which is approximately 132 years after the great pandemic that we all call the Black Plague, right?
Yep.
So he is growing up within the shadow of the Middle Ages, the shadow of the Dark Ages, all that really like Gothic artwork at cathedrals and basilicas.
Yep.
It was in the late, I want to say it was either 1200s or 1300s that it was in Italian painting and wood carving around churches. But you started seeing these images, and it was the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child. But the Christ child was actually crucifixion Jesus as a baby.
Wow.
And the idea was to remind you that the baby of the manger is the baby of Good Friday. But the other part of that was that pastoral care idea of people who had lost children. To Black Plague or anything like that, to let them know that, Mary's there, God's there, Mary's there, to kind of put that in, right? So this is the world that Luther is growing up in, which is the wake of a pandemic, the worst one in world history. And then by the time Luther was 9 years old, there was the discovery of the Americas.
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So
Air quotes necessary, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you, it, that's crazy to think that everything that we consider Lutheran history happened in the wake of the Black Plague.
Yeah.
You know, and so when I look at, and then by 1517, when Luther was 30, approximately 30-ish, he nailed the 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg. And by that point in time, we were in the Renaissance era. So like, he grew up in the wake of a plague, the world got a little bigger, and then welcomed in the Renaissance, right? So I think about Lutheranism and what it looks like in 21st century America, and how people are getting really scared about the state of the pandemic in the world and this sort of thing.
Yes.
But on the other side of that, Lutheranism was born on the back end of a pandemic.
That's right. And if I remember correctly, there was a scare, not an all-out pandemic, but there was a scare that it was either that the Black Plague specifically was coming back, or that a new pandemic was coming on, that Martin Luther wrote about. People asked him for advice on their responses, because one of the big questions during this scare was, if I need to take care of other people in my town, but I might be exposing myself to a virus, well, they wouldn't call it a virus back then, to this sickness.
Yeah.
In doing so, what's the faithful response? And it was just a fantastic early example of our Lutheran kind of dialectic responses, and the ways that we refuse to, that, what's that old saying, for every complicated problem there's an answer that's both simple and wrong. And Luther, I remember reading a letter of his from that time that said something to the effect of, you, all of you as followers of Christ, have a God-given duty to respect your bodies and your health, because you are created in the image of God as God bearers, image bearers. You have this duty to protect your health. There's not a sense of faithfulness to act recklessly with your personal health, with your body. You also have a duty, you are duty bound to love your neighbor as yourself and to care for them in your need. And then, of course, the response is, well, but Dr. Luther, that sounds kind of contradictory, so tell me what to do. And I know he would have said, you have a duty, and he would have just repeated the two and said, now, if one decision or the other is the right one, you need to pray and discern God's call, because all we can do in the church is teach you about these different Christian duties and the principles that we live by. And then we have to be able to trust in God's Holy Spirit within those situations. That's where that phrase "sin boldly" comes in, right? Where if you don't know, if you're genuinely trying to follow where God is leading and it turns out it was the wrong decision, we believe God's going to say, hey, thank you for sinning boldly. You didn't know what decision to make, but you made one, and you tried to follow where God was calling. And that's so Lutheran, that we refuse to give simplistic, pat answers to complicated questions, but we do work so hard on establishing the principles behind these decisions that we need to make in such a complicated life.
So, I mean, that being said, and with the world just kind of being in the place where it is right now, I mean, pandemics and social unrest and we'll just say polemicized politics and all these sorts of things. I don't know, what are your hopes for our Lutheran tradition as we look forward from this pandemic?
Yeah, there are, so for our Lutheran tradition, I want us to, first of all, not fall into that trap of thinking that we have to go with simplistic answers because that tends to resonate more with people. Here's the ecumenical piece. We are not meant to try to be the denomination for each and every single 100% of faithful Christians in this country or on this globe. Right. We are going to, our approach, if there are people that just absolutely need that very simple approach, tell me how to live my life and I'll live it that way, there are denominations that do that. They fit a part of the mosaic that we don't fit really well, but they fit a part of the whole mosaic of the Church Universal, the Church Catholic, as we say in the Creed. I just really hope that we can continue to embrace the nuanced approaches that we have always brought to the overall kind of, as to take that word again, mosaic of the church universal. And understand that sometimes that's not going to work for some people. I mean, sometimes people are going to say, that's just, I would rather things be simple and clear than complicated, but maybe more accurate. And okay, that's going to mean every once in a while we lose folks, hopefully, to other good, faithful denominations. But I just hope we're true to the gospel, and that in that sense of bringing nuance and complexity to the ways that we approach ministry, that doesn't ever give us an excuse not to be intense and energetic and passionate about the ways that we do ministry. It's still an absolutely energetic and God-called endeavor that we engage in. But boy, there's a lot of twists and turns along the way.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm always reminded whenever I'm in interfaith or ecumenical conversations. I believe it's in John's gospel where Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he goes, I have sheep of other folds that you do not know.
Yeah.
You know? And so that's always one of my hopes for people. I'm like, all right, like I do the Lutheran thing. And I do that with a lot of pride, because I think that there's so much depth and richness, and most importantly, gospel in our tradition.
Absolutely.
But it's just like what you're saying. Some people, they don't want that approach, What was it? LSTC, Lutheran School of Theology, where you and I graduated from.
Yeah.
They were doing, their tagline for a year was "No easy answers."
Wow. Yeah.
And some people are not attracted to like, wait, you want me to come in and then you're just going to be more confusing? And so if that's the case, hey man, there are other flocks, like, that's cool. I hope you have that connection. I hope you find, your path to God, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
You talked about the nimbleness and the kind of the innovation that the pandemic has forced us into. I would love to hear that. I'm thinking about two examples from our own congregation, and they don't have to do with the response to the pandemic, but just a general ministry, one of which I feel like we've done well, and one of which I specifically haven't done so well with. When we get challenged by something like a pandemic, sometimes it forces us, in the best of circumstances, it forces us to be nimble and innovative and to live into just what we've been talking about. But sometimes it just exposes where we say, wow, I got pressed on it and I wasn't up to the task. Thank goodness we believe that it's all by God's grace that we're saved, right? So our confirmation program, we have a pretty traditional confirmation program. The only way that, as I was looking back, the only way that it's changed is that I've had to cancel a few sessions. And so our confirmation students are getting a more compressed, probably less nuanced and really rich confirmation experience. And I've looked back at that and said, what was it that didn't inspire me to be able to innovate and figure out how to do it, to be flexible and nimble in this time? But then with children's ministry, younger children's ministry, in our worship services, we've gone through a whole kind of rejuvenation process of making sure that it's going to be super engaging for kids, because of the ways that we can't, get people physically together as much. It has forced us to think about every possible way within a worship service that we can get kids actively engaged and actually taking leadership roles. So it's interesting to look through ministry and think, where has this caused innovation, nimbleness, that necessity being the mother of invention, whereas where have we just failed in the face of it and need to do better next time and trust boldly in God's grace? Yeah
No, absolutely, because especially for the first 4 or 5 months of all of this, right, we were all shooting in the dark.
Oh yeah.
We were just and again, a brief aside, which is a thank you, when I put together the worship companion, and I was trying to get people on board, because I'm like, all right, because that was my thing. I was like, all right, I know I can probably get some people on Zoom. I know I have a lot of people who won't do that. So again, how do we figure out how to create an overall experience that is one and done, that will cover people until the end of the liturgical year? And again, it goes back to connections, right? Like, thank goodness I knew you and 27 other people that I could call up and
Absolutely.
offload that work on. And, you know, some people really get into it, and some people, they're like, all right, I just got on the Zoom thing anyway. But it's, you know, you throw it out there and you hope, it's like spaghetti on the wall. You hope it sticks, you know? Right. So I guess if I have a closing question, it would be this: what else can we at Faith do to support and care for those impacted in your greater community and the stuff that you're kind of helping keep together?
Yeah, it's a great question and a very generous question to close with. And you and your folks at Faith have already helped tremendously in material ways. You know, I hope you've prayed for us as well. We're trying to keep you in prayer. That usually those are the things that we think of helping financially when a need comes up, or materially, I guess, is a more general way to say it, and keeping people in prayer. And I would say this might be a little bit of a, you know, side response, but I think it's accurate. To me, the most important thing that Faith Lutheran can do right now to help people in need, you know, in our community or wherever they are, is to strengthen the bonds of your own community together. And I mean that because of the contrast that I see between close-knit communities, people with an embedded sense of community, with how they've responded to both pandemic and fires, versus the people that have been trying to go at it alone, who just seem to be absolutely devastated with I mean, they're completely at the end of their ropes. And so I guess the idea of what I'm trying to get at is, every time that you and your congregation are getting together in ways that strengthens the bonds of your community, I feel like you're preparing for the next response that needs to be there. And we're trying to do the same thing. And so we are getting that wonderful money that you've raised. We're going to get it right into the hands where it needs to go. We are appreciating and loving your prayers for people out here in the West and for those fires. We're going to pray for you as well. And I think for all of us, strengthening the bonds of our own community is a way of basically saying, I'm preparing myself to be a resilient, responsive person and a resilient, responsive congregation the next time one of these things comes around. Because what are the odds that a new, you know, crisis will come about sometime in the near future? I don't know, 100% or so. So yeah.
And that's a lot to think about. That is a lot to think about. This idea that by strengthening your community, by strengthening your congregation, you're strengthening your response to that. And that's really amazing.
Yeah. And, you know, I think this may be a longer response than you were looking for the concluding question, but I think about you mentioned we were roommates in seminary, and our seminary roommate, who was also named Dan, he had a story about one of his friends that, you know, had dreams for what he wanted to do as a career. And it was just so clear that his skill sets and what he wanted to do just didn't match up. I think he wanted to go into, you know, study biology and be the person to cure cancer or something like that. And there was a professor that had worked closely with that guy, as Dan told the story, and had built just such a strong friendship. And that professor sat down with him and said, look, it's just clear to me this is not what you're meant to do. And you're wasting time in finding what you are meant to do by obsessing over this dream that just clearly isn't for you. And because that professor had already formed the relationship, in that case, it's not a whole community, but it's one individual relationship, the message got across. Now you imagine another professor who was just meeting him for the first time, trying to sit down and have that conversation. It would have been a disaster.
Yeah.
It would have sounded like, you know, who are you to tell me what to do? So when you strengthen those bonds ahead of time, you're just preparing yourself ahead of time to respond to whatever need as it arises. So I think, you know, we're going to try to do that on our end, and I know you are as well, because you've been working so hard with your community thus far.
We're trying, man. Reverend Eric Wooldridge, pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church, and do I say it right? Enumclaw?
Enumclaw is the word.
So no, I don't say it right. Pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Enumclaw, Washington. Man,
You got it.
My friend, I appreciate your time as always. Thank you for being part of this. And yeah, man, we look forward for our paths crossing again.
No question. I really appreciate the invitation. It's always good to talk.
All right, man.